Welcome back to Outside Views, and today we're not talking about predictions or forecasts, but cold, hard economic reality. And the subject is the economic fallout from the UK's decision to leave the European Union, and the news is an absolute unmitigated disaster that confirms the most dire warnings of a decade ago, where you all called me, scaremonger? Well, a major new study from the prestigious National Bureau for Economic Research, based on almost 9 years of data since the 2016 referendum, reveals the truth that the political establishment has tried desperately to ignore. Brexit has decimated the UK economy. And I know I talked about this 2 days ago already, but we need to talk more deeply about that. And my strong personal view is that this study is the final definitive indictment of the entire Brexit project, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that it was an act of profound, self-inflicted economic vandalism perpetrated for purely ideological reasons. And the figures are shocking. By 2025, the UK's gross domestic product, or GDP, has been reduced by as much as 8% from where it would have been if the country had remained within the EU. So much about the 4% forecast by the OBR. And this isn't a minor rounding error or a short-term difficulty. This is a permanent structural reduction in the national wealth, equivalent to losing the entire output of a major UK city every single year, or a major sector, as I talked about 2 days ago. It's an almost unimaginable tragedy that was entirely avoidable, and the cost is now being paid by every household in the UK, in the form of higher prices, stagnant wages, and diminished public services. The NBER research is critical because it moves beyond short-term market reactions, and it captures the full, gradually accumulating impact over a sustained period since the 2016 vote. The downward spiral, according to The Economist, didn't wait for the formal withdrawal in 2020. It began immediately in the aftermath of the referendum result. The study pinpoints 4 specific interconnected channels through which this economic poison has flowed, showing why the initial impact assessments that suggested a smaller hit, I just mentioned the OBR, have been dramatically underestimated. And I already told you about the uncertainty, and that right after the vote slammed the brakes on business confidence and investment. And when firms cannot be sure about their future trading relationship or customs requirement or labor supply, they simply stop committing capital. And the result is laid bare in the numbers. Investment into the country has dropped sharply by an estimated 12 to 18%. And this is a colossal blow because investment is the fuel for future productivity and growth. When investment flatlines, the economy stops innovating, stops upgrading technology, and eventually productivity, the measure of wealth generated per hour worked, and that stagnates. And this brings us to the second and third channels, which explain why the general malaise is now so deeply felt across the country. The study estimates that both employment and productivity have been severely hampered, with each data set reduced by 3% to 4% from previous projections over the last decade. A 3 to 4% drop in productivity is an economic disaster, meaning the country is fundamentally less efficient and less competitive than it should be. And this productivity collapse is fueled in part by the third channel, the diverted management time. Think of all the businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, that now spend countless hours on new paperwork, customs declarations, rules of origin checks and compliance that were completely unnecessary when the UK was in the single market. And this time is a deadweight loss. It's time that could have been spent innovating, securing new contracts or training staff, but is instead wasted on self-imposed bureaucracy. And the fourth key channel, of course, is reduced demand and the increased misallocation of resources from the protected Brexit process. The friction at the new trade border with the EU has made UK exports to its largest nearest market just more expensive and more complex, directly shrinking the effective market size for British firms. The most productive internationally exposed firms, which should have been leading the nation's growth, have been most negatively impacted, reducing the overall national rate of growth and misallocating capital away from these high growth areas. And the sheer magnitude of these figures, 8% of GDP, 12 to 18% of investment, cannot be overstated, and it puts into devastating perspective the false promises made by the proponents of leaving the EU. They promised a Brexit dividend that would fund public services and new global trade deals that would turbocharge the economy. And what you have received in the UK is the opposite. A massive quantifiable economic hole that generates billions less in tax revenue every year. And this reduced tax revenue is the real reason why the government is now struggling with a fiscal black hole that they can fill only by either breaking a manifesto promise to raise income tax or by making savage cuts to public spending. The political choice to leave the single market has directly resulted in an economic necessity to make ordinary citizens poorer. That's a cruel irony for a project sold on the back of improving their lives. And it's no wonder that the political landscape has been completely upended by this economic failure. As the reports note, you can't help but feel those responsible for Brexit should not, for example, be riding high in the polls with a new party. And this is a direct reference to the continued prominence of figures like Nigel Farage, whose new party is now capitalizing on the anger and frustration caused by the very economic failure he helped engineer. The public is experiencing a general malaise and an accumulation of real-world hardship, but they are incorrectly channeling that justified anger towards the incumbent government or even towards immigrants rather than the root cause, which is the self-inflicted damage of Brexit and Nigel Farage. And the situation is now so entrenched that even the current government's attempts to fix the problem are stalling. The initial priority of the Prime Minister and his leadership was a Brexit reset, a kind of pragmatic attempt to seek close alignment with the EU to mitigate at least some of the economic damage. But the reports show that talks have cooled and the political courage to confront the ideological purists who still demand regulatory divergence has waned. And this is the ultimate tragedy. The economic harm is now so large and so well documented that the only responsible path forward is to acknowledge the mistake and strategically repair the damage by rebuilding closer ties with the rest of Europe. Yet, the political climate remains so toxic and defined by the populist right that any step towards a pragmatic reset is treated as an act of political treachery. And the British are trapped in a political paradox. The more economically damaging Brexit proves to be, the more politically difficult it becomes to fix it, because the original architects of the catastrophe continue to wield outsized influence. And this study, using almost a decade of data and rigorous macro and micro analysis, comparing the UK's performance to a synthetic control group of up to 33 comparable countries, is the definitive verdict. And the way they did that makes me absolutely ignore every Brexiteer comment that will come with the war in Ukraine and with the pandemic. Everybody else was struck by that too. That's why they did this big comparison group. And the experts were not just right. They underestimated the severity of the long-term product impact at the time. And the 8% hit to GDP is not just a number. It represents a permanent forfeiture of national opportunity. Less money for schools, less money for hospitals. Yeah, you remember the bus. And less prosperity for generations to come. And it's a catastrophe that defines the decade, and the responsibility for it is now an undeniable historical fact. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen.